Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. The land, a theme of indigeneity, or the fourth world. The land is treasured. The land is spiritual. The land is the mother. The land is the place which gives birth to the people, to the animals which reside upon it. The land should not be stolen, and yet it often is, as in Gaza. Gaza is a fourth world place, a treasured place, a special place, part of the remnants of Palestine, or what is now called Israel. Sadly, that land, taken by the United Nations, changed into Israel. Its residents forced into outlying territories, deprived of their birthright, deprived of their land, exiled, forced into penal colonies without having committed a crime. Now, in Gaza, being slaughtered. And for what? For the protection of the capitalist world system. And that is all. So, in the capitalist world system, land does not matter. What matters is money, wealth, oil, resources, but using those resources to make a profit, which is the root of capitalism. The heart of indigeneity is the land. The heart of the rest of the world that is not indigenous is profit, or it is self. It is a sense of disconnectedness, or what Roy Bhaskar, the founder of critical realism, referred to as demi-reality. And so we can create a kind of typology between indigeneity and capitalism based on the land. Indigeneity is structured around the land. You can't have true indigeneity without a love of the land as the mother. The land which gives birth not only to the people, but to the animals, to the vegetation. The land is loved. The land is treasured. Outside of indigeneity, outside of the fourth world, the land is used. So the land in the first world has a purely pragmatic value. If that pragmatic value cannot be realized, it is dispensed with. For example, I spent 4 years living in southern Appalachia, the mountains of southwestern Virginia. If you have an image in your head of what West Virginia looks like, that's what Southwest Virginia looks like. West Virginia is simply a bit to the north, but it really is the same place. So is eastern Kentucky, and so are parts of northwest Tennessee. You travel through the mountains of southern Appalachia, and you see the mountains which have been stripped for coal mining, stripped and then stripped again, and then stripped again and again and again, all to make a profit for the companies that own that land or have seized the land from the people who live there. That area where I lived, Wise, Virginia, most likely you've never heard of it. It's right next to Pound, Virginia, Coburn, Virginia, and Norton, Virginia, all relatively obscure places in the United States. When I was there, very difficult to get to. The roads were treacherous. Many people would fall off the mountains, especially in the winter. Why? There were no railings on the roads, on the two-lane, sometimes one-lane used as two-lane roads. People would skid on the ice, and they would fall off the edge of the mountain in their cars. Happened all the time. It was a regular story where I lived. In fact, it happened so often. Sometimes it wasn't even a story. It was ignored. It was so common. It was so common. So what happened to the Appalachian Mountains? They were destroyed. They were destroyed to the extent that when you drive through them in the summer or in the spring or part of the fall, it's really, really ugly. Really, really ugly. It's like you're seeing mountain stumps. Not very attractive at all. At one time, though, it was very different. That land was very, very attractive. In the winter, when it snows, it's a different story. The mountains or the mountain stumps are covered by snow. The ugliness is camouflaged, and it looks very attractive. But that attractiveness really is only an illusion created by the snow. The appearance of that place has become so ugly in the minds of many people that they have argued for literally destroying the rest of the mountains, flattening them, because the mountains have no value anymore. They used to be nice. Drive through them, walk through them. They're not nice anymore. And so why not simply tear them down altogether? That is a view which is held by many people, including by many people who live in southern Appalachia. And it is an understandable viewpoint. When I lived there, I felt the same way. But in retrospect, when I look back on my time in that part of the United States, I see it a bit differently. I see those destroyed mountains as testimonies to the destructive power of capitalism. That capitalism makes the world ugly. It takes places that once were characterized by beauty and magnificence, and it brings them down into places that no one wants to see anymore. So that is the story in much of the world. Places that really were attractive areas, beautiful places, have now become urbanized or suburbanized, used as places of residence or of industry. And the land itself, as places of beauty, have been destroyed to make room. I see that happening right now where I live in the Rio Grande Valley. Here where I am in Mission, Texas, most of the land now is developed. Most of it. Either stores, homes. You drive through it and there really isn't much to see. It used to be a place of grapefruit farms. Grapefruit farms covered the land. There are still some, but not that many. And every year, there are fewer and fewer, making room for the massive growth which is taking place here in the Rio Grande Valley, one of the fastest growing areas of the United States. Right next to Mission is a town called Palmview. Palmview looks like what Mission used to be. You drive through Palmview, through Palm Ridge and Alton, all next to each other and all next to Mission. But Palmview, Palm Ridge, and Alton are still beautiful. They have not been developed. The land is still very attractive. You can drive through them and appreciate them. They are places where one can sit and quietly meditate, because the land has not yet been seized by the capitalist world system, but it will. It will. In the coming decade or 2 decades, there will be no more Palmview, Alton, or Palm Ridge as we think of them today. I mean, the names of the cities will remain, I assume, but the areas will simply become a part of the contiguous metropolitan suburbia of this area. There really is no central city here. It's basically suburbs piled upon suburbs, piled upon other suburbs. And so that's what capitalism does. Capitalism is like Shiva. In Hinduism, Shiva is the great destroyer. And that is how capitalism operates. It destroys, and when it's finished destroying one place, it moves on to another and then destroys that. That is capitalism. So capitalism is the enemy of indigenism or fourth worldism, and the enemy of indigeneity itself. Being an indigenous person, capitalism has no use for indigeneity. Look at what has happened to Palestine. Palestine used to be a beautiful place with wonderful homes, wonderful agriculture. Then the future Israelis migrated in droves, destroyed that land, exiled its residents to borderline areas like what is now called Gaza and the West Bank, and took the land for themselves. Israel is now one of the most congested places on the face of the earth. It is approximately the size of the state of New Jersey in the United States, but with a much larger population. Too large, really, for the area in which it is, much too large. And yet it grows and it grows. And so now, what is happening? Well, the government of Israel, realizing that it is rapidly running out of land, rapidly running out of places to feed the goddess Shiva, or the god Shiva, I suppose, is now in Gaza. And so the Israeli Defense Forces are killing Gazans by the thousands, cornering them into a place called Rafah, where they may eventually be exterminated. Either that, or driven into another penal colony in Egypt, which lies in Africa, or if not, forced to build boats and go to the sea. That is what capitalism does. Capitalism is disgusting. Capitalism, I would say, is the worst economic system that we have ever had on this planet. Previous economic systems have worked with the land. Capitalism does not. Capitalism works against the land. And by working against the land, it works against indigeneity. Because capitalism has no use for indigenous people. Indeed, indigenous people are the enemies of capitalism, because indigenous people prevent the expansion of capitalism into new regions. So when you look at what is happening now in Gaza and ask, why is it happening? Why? Capitalism, pure capitalism. That is all. Whatever is necessary for capitalism to succeed will be promoted. And so a lot of Israelis have taken to the streets calling Gazans, of all things, Nazis, which literally makes no sense. Factually, it makes no sense. There's no legitimacy to that concept. How in the world can the indigenous people of Palestine be called Nazis? If anything, it is the Israelis who are behaving like fascists. And if you didn't know, Adolf Hitler himself was originally a disciple of Benito Mussolini. He was originally a fascist. That inspired him when he took over the Nazi Party. And if you wondered, why is it that it is called National Socialism? National Socialism is represented by the acronym Nazi. Hitler was only willing to retain that term. Yes, as I said, retain it. He did not coin it, because he redefined socialism as nationalism. That is the only way he could justify it. I would assume, although I don't know, that if he could not figure out some way to rationalize it, it would be called something else. But who cares what it's called? It's destructive. It's pure destruction. Nazism was capitalism carried to an extreme, much as Israel represents capitalism carried to an extreme, although I would not compare them completely to each other. I think that when many people try to make these Hitler comparisons, they are being very misguided. Hitler was Hitler. There was only one Hitler. There was only one Nazi Germany. Israel, for all of its faults, for all of its disgusting behaviors toward the Palestinians, is not Nazi Germany. It is something else. That something else is not good, but it's not the same as Nazi Germany was. And so, the land, the importance of treasuring the land, that existed in Palestine. And it was destroyed by Israel, much as it existed in many other parts of the world, like along the Amazon River, when there were places, tribes along the Amazon River as recently as the 1970s and 1980s, who literally had no contact with the global north or the first world. No contact at all. They spoke their own languages, and some of those languages were made of mere clicks. Clicks. They wore no clothing in many cases. They were seen as deserving of protection. Well, that is until the logging industry got involved, and they wanted those forests for themselves. So, money talks. Capitalism is more important than indigeneity. And so the logging industry persuaded many of the governments in those areas to give the land to them. And so those former people who were indigenous and isolated now have TVs, computers, they wear clothing, and they speak Spanish or Portuguese. That is the result of capitalism. Pure and total destruction. Wherever it goes, capitalism manifests itself as Shiva once again, and then again, and again, and again. And just when you think that capitalism has reached its final goal, it finds a new place to develop, again, as where I am living. Those beautiful areas like Palmview will in 10 or 20 years no longer exist. Now, are they indigenous? No, or if they were, not anymore. But they are still beautiful. Really, really beautiful places. I would encourage any of you who can to come down to the Rio Grande Valley and visit Palmview, Palm Ridge, and Alton. Those cities in particular. See the farms. See the beautiful castles. The beautiful people who live in those areas. The wonderful Mexican Americans in those towns. And realize that shortly they will no longer be there, or if they are, they will be working for large corporations. Right now, there is a project of building 2 interstates right through this area, including Palmview. One of them is called I-2. I-2 is 2 blocks from me. It cuts right through some of those areas, including Palmview. There was no I-2 a few years ago. There is now. What will happen when I-2 is completed and the rest of the interstate system surrounding I-2 is completed as well, is that this area, which is already one of the most rapidly growing places in the US, will grow even faster. What is preventing that growth from becoming even more rapid right now are the roads. The roads which come into this area are mostly rural highways. And that discourages people from living in a place. People want to have access to high-speed transportation in their cars or in trains. There are airports here, 3 of them, 3 international airports. But when people travel, they don't generally fly, they generally drive. And that is being taken care of. The drivers are being protected. The land is not. So people will come here. They will be protected. But the land itself will not. So, the land. How it is seen depends upon the area. In Gaza, you have the indigenous Palestinians who love the land and who, despite all of their obstacles, are willing to fight for it against the virtually insurmountable enemy, Israel. That same Israel which is now destroying them, but they are still willing to fight as much as they can. And their fighting is not really working that well because Israel, coupled with the US, have them vastly outnumbered. What can they do? Not much. Capitalism, again, as Shiva, destroys and leaves nothing behind but steel and concrete. The people in the area, after a couple of generations, will not even remember what it was at one time. They will be fully assimilated into modern society. How sad. How sad. And so the point of this episode of my podcast is to argue for the protection of the land, especially the lands of indigenous people. Because to many indigenous people, those lands are like churches or temples or shrines. They are places of worship and celebration and commemoration. But since Westerners, people of the global North, have no concept of that, they just see the land as having a proprietary value and don't appreciate the indigenous view of the land. And so I hope that people who are not indigenous, and I am one of them, I'm sure I had indigenous ancestors somewhere back then, but I'm not indigenous myself, neither were my parents, neither were my grandparents, or even my great-grandparents. And so I really can't understand it directly. I have no eye for it. I can't really see it. I can only study it as a sociologist. I can appreciate it. I can love it. I can treasure it. But that's as far as I can go. But I can also understand that other people have a different way of seeing, the land than I do. And if I am respectful of them, if I appreciate who they are, like the Gazans, the Palestinians, then I will always remember to put the land ahead of profit. Profit does not matter. Profit is tearing our world apart through climate change, all with the ends of making profit. That's all it is. We are destroying our planet for the sake of capitalist expansion, with no concern for what happens to our descendants, with no concern right now for what happens to the indigenous people of the land. So again, I care about the land, to repeat, of indigenous people. The third world itself, I want to protect from imperialism and colonialism, but the third world, I want to protect from capitalism as a whole, so that their land is not allowed to become simply a commodity for the profit of capitalists. For the time being, this has been Mark, by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.